Hi, this is Peter Dorman, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of the economics portion of Alternatives in and to Capitalism. Today's topic, supply and demand. So this is the famous supply and demand diagram that you see in economics textbooks and elsewhere online in the media and so on. What are we going to talk about today? Well, first of all, where do the curves come from? There are these curves that are sitting in a diagram, but why do people draw them the way they do? We will discuss the difference between movement along a curve and movement of a curve, and we'll talk about, in particular, the idea of equilibrium, a market equilibrium, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and why we care about it, and finally, how to use supply and demand curves for economic analysis. So let's start with the supply curve. So we have some kind of a good, and it could be anything that might be supplied in a market, and we're interested in the representation of how that supply might respond to the price of the good being sold. So that would be the supply curve. Supply curve is that relationship. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how you make the good in question. So if it's a car, for instance, it depends on how assembly lines are set up and how quickly they operate and how much labor it takes. Depends on the prices of the things that you need to produce things. So if it's a car, what's the price of labor for the car? What about all the materials that go into the car? How much do they cost? Clearly, the supply in the market depends on the expectations of sellers of the future conditions that they're likely to face. So if they think prices are going to go up in the future, they might hold back some of the supply currently, or vice versa. Or maybe they have expectations about what their competitors are going to do. When you begin to think about all the different factors that affect the supply of goods to the economy, it can be enormous, and it takes a lot of research for any particular item to get a sense of that. However, the supply curve simplifies the problem enormously by focusing on just one factor, which is the selling price. So in the case of a car, how much the car sells for in the market. Specifically, what the supply curve does is it operates on the assumption that every factor that affects the supply of the good to the market is held constant, and like in an experiment where we only change one item, we're only going to change, we'll dial up or dial down the price of the good that it sells for, and the relationship between how much is supplied and that selling price is the supply curve. So as the price that's charged in the market goes up, what do you suppose will be the response of suppliers? Will they supply more or supply less? Well, it goes up as well, typically. So normally, if you think you can get more money for producing and selling something, you'll supply more of it. And out of that comes the supply curve, where higher prices for the good in question are associated with higher quantities supplied to the market. And that's represented visually by this red S-curve in a diagram where on the vertical side we're measuring prices, and on the horizontal side, or axis, we're measuring the quantities supplied. Now there are two different adjustments that you might make using this diagram. One is you might move along the supply curve. So you could start out at a point, for instance, like P1. In P1, you're down at the lower left, you have a lower quantity, a lower price, and then if the price rises up to P2, you would expect the quantity supplied to go up to Q2. This type of analysis depends on maintaining the assumption that all the factors that were held constant to draw that supply curve remain unchanged. And the only thing that's changing is the price. But of course, the supply curve is a relationship between the price and the quantity. So if everything else remains the same and only the price changes, you're moving along the curve. However, maybe something in the world has changed. In fact, usually that's what you do when you do economic analysis. What would be the effect of this change or that? And if it's one of the things that's being held constant, you would expect the entire curve to shift. So in this case, we have a shift of a supply curve from the red line to the purple line, from S1 to S2. This is a leftward or an upward, depending on how you look at it, shift of the supply curve, which would be based on some factor which would lead producers to supply less at any price. So whatever the price, they'll supply less. Now we do the same thing for the demand curve. The demand curve is a relationship where what you're trying to predict is the quantity that consumers will demand. It obviously depends on a lot of things, just like the supply curve does. What consumers like and don't like, the income that consumers have, the competing goods that consumers might buy if they don't buy this particular thing. Again, as in supply, expectations of the future are very important. Lots of things depending on what the good is and the price consumers have to pay. So if you hold everything else constant and change only the price, you might imagine getting a relationship between the price consumers pay and how much they're willing to buy, and that's the demand curve. So as the price goes up in the market, what do you think will happen to the amount that people want to buy? Well, presumably it would go down. At higher prices, people would typically buy less. So the demand curve is downward sloping. Decreasing prices are associated with increasing quantities demanded as we move from the upper left to the lower right. So that's pictured again in the movement along the demand curve. We can imagine starting out at a point like P1 and Q1, some initial price and quantity, and then let's say that the price falls to P2, we would expect the quantity purchased to go up, let's say to Q2, and that movement along the curve would arise if everything else that affects demand, only the price changes, if everything else is held constant. We would have movement of the demand curve if one of the factors that determines that relationship changes. So consumer income or other competing goods or whatever it might be, new news about the product in question. So in this particular case, the demand curve has shifted down and to the left from D1 to D2. So you can either get movement along a curve or movement of a curve. It's really important to know which one to adopt if you're doing supply and demand analysis. Next step, there are three possible states that a market can be in. One is that you could have excess supply. So the amount that's being supplied to the market by the sellers is greater than the amount that consumers wish to purchase. In that case, of course, some of the goods won't be sold, and in that situation, you're going to have some sellers who are going to be very unhappy because the goods are piling up. They're not selling them. That situation, and the other situation you could have is excess demand. So in excess demand, the consumers want to buy a lot, the suppliers aren't supplying as much as they want, and then you have a shortage of goods. In that case, it's the consumers who are going to be frustrated. They want to buy stuff and it's not there on the market. The only other possibility of the three is that they could be equal. And if they're equal, that's what we mean by an equilibrium in this context. There's a more general notion of equilibrium. We won't get into it here. So those are the three possible states. It's really important, this is a point that I'll be making repeatedly over the course of the quarter, it's really important to understand these are not value judgments. A shortage is not necessarily a bad thing, a surplus is not necessarily a bad thing, an equilibrium is not necessarily a good thing. The clearest case of that is illegal nuclear weapons. There are bad people out there that would love to get their hands on a nuclear weapon for criminal or ideological purposes, and most of us hope, I assume, that they don't get them. So a shortage, a big shortage of nuclear weapons on the market, on the black market, would be a very good thing, that they wouldn't be offered for sale, even though there are a lot of people who want to buy them. An equilibrium where the number of nuclear weapons that criminals and terrorists want to buy is equal to the number of nuclear weapons that disgruntled scientists or whatever want to sell, That would be an equilibrium in economic terms, but it would mean disaster in human terms. So these are not value categories. They're simply descriptions of three possible states of a market. Now think through more carefully what happens in these states. In a shortage, as I mentioned before, it's the sellers who are frustrated. The buyers who are frustrated, and that puts the sellers in a very strong position. Either from the buying side or the selling side, there can be pressure to drive up the price. So the sellers might see, oh, hey, there's a shortage out there in the market. I can charge a higher price and still sell everything. So they might raise their prices. Similarly, a buyer might say, well, I really want this stuff and there's not enough out there. What if I raise my offer that I'm willing to pay and maybe somebody will supply it to me? So you see this, for instance, in ticket scalping, where there might be a shortage of tickets for a sports event or a rock concert. And both on the buyer's side and on the seller's side, there's pressure to drive up ticket prices. So if that happens, and if the price does go up, there will typically be more supply. So people see higher prices. They say, hey, I'll sell something, get some of that price. There would typically be lower demand. So people see the higher price and say, I'm not sure if I want this. And between the two, that's going to combine to reduce the amount of the shortage. So a shortage has a kind of feedback effect that's built into it, which is going to reduce it over time. It'll change the market without any outside intervention. It's just the buyers and sellers will change what they're doing. The same story applies to a surplus. Here, it's the sellers who are frustrated. They have stuff that they can't sell, puts the buyers in a strong position, and from either the buyer or the seller side, there can be pressure to drive the prices down, and lower prices will have a tendency to reduce the supply but increase the demand, offsetting that original surplus. So that's an internal process within the market that tends to reduce surpluses when they arise. So here's an example. Consider SUVs. These are larger cars which typically have lower gas mileage than others. One of the things that happened a decade ago when we had the economic crisis is that initially oil prices shot way up to the highest level they had ever been. Just almost overnight, oil prices went up dramatically. Because oil prices went up, there was a big decline in demand for SUVs. And the result was a surplus on the market. It actually drove General Motors into bankruptcy temporarily. They had vehicles, these large, clunky, low-mileage vehicles, they couldn't sell. So these unsold SUVs are sitting on dealer lots. In that situation, what do you suppose would happen? Well, similarly, after the oil prices declined rapidly, which they did a few months after they went up, there was the opposite situation where suddenly people said, hey, gas is cheap. I think I'm going to get some big monster hunking car and put my family and everybody else's family into it. And so the demand for these big vehicles went up, and then there was a shortage and long waiting times. And what do you suppose would happen there? So in the first case, well, we'll see it visually. In the first case, scenario one, we have the increase in oil prices. And so that causes the demand curve for SUVs to shift from the blue line D1 to the brown line D2. And the result of that was a surplus at the old price of at the price that was being charged. There were more SUVs being supplied than demanded, and the gap between those two lines that's indicated in the diagram shows you the surplus. So because there was a surplus, there was a tendency for the price to fall. Now we can ask the same question about the next scenario. What happens if the price of oil falls and demand increases for SUVs? Well, then the demand curve shifts to the right. There's now a shortage. That will have a tendency to create a price increase. So in either case, you can see a kind of counteracting tendency of prices to temporary surpluses or shortages. So what happens in a market equilibrium? Well, there's no shortage, there's no surplus, because that's where supply equals demand, which means there's nothing inside the market itself which is going to change it. There can still be change, but it will come from outside the market, at least the market for that particular good. So if the market for SUVs is in equilibrium, it's only something else in the economy, a change in oil prices, an increase or decrease in consumer incomes, or maybe a strike by auto workers or what have you, that can change that market. But the market itself for SUVs will not change because there's no shortage or no surplus. So that is a summary of why equilibrium is an interesting concept. In an equilibrium situation, the market comes to a kind of rest, at least the market for that particular good. And again, equilibrium has no value significance in itself. It's just a stable situation. We often use the word equilibrium in everyday life to imply something positive. In a wellness program, for instance, they might promise to increase your internal equilibrium or some physical or mental equilibrium, and we think, oh, that's good, I want to be in equilibrium. But in the market, equilibrium is not intrinsically a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a stable thing. And it's particularly interesting for economists because with the story that we have about shortages and surpluses, we expect changes in the market towards an equilibrium. So the equilibrium becomes a kind of center of attraction for where markets will tend to move. That's very useful for analytical purposes. So this is summing up, for the most part, what we have in mind when we talk about using supply and demand analysis for economic purposes. What you should get from this is the notion that markets are allocative institutions. They're allocative institutions. By that, I mean they make decisions in themselves about economic variables, like what goods should be produced or not produced, what quantities of goods will be produced in the market, what qualities those goods will have, because the qualities will affect demand and supply. What about the methods that are used to produce them? Which people will acquire the goods that are produced? Will they go to these people or those people? And very importantly, how much will people be paid for producing those goods and supplying them to the market? And all of this is analyzed in economics on the basis of looking at how the economic forces at work affect supply curves and demand curves. That's it for now.